In the dead of night, they were walking down the street looking.
In neuroscientific theory, it is often assumed that human behavior is determined by the brain, or even by its underlying DNA. However, no species has as much sociological and/or psychological leeway as humans. Since the dawn of modern humans, technology has been compensating for an imminent biological deficit through which the naked great ape has come to live and rule all over the world. This webinar covers biological determinism, as well as the innovative psychological, technological and sociological adaptability of humans. It is concluded that we are at least as much our technology as our brains.
We're human.
Did you ever notice? Almost without exception, Elvis Presley imitators technically sing better than Elvis did. Yet they all miss the magic. Exchange Elvis for any other game-changing star, thinker, writer or scientist and the clue remains exactly the same. Technically better performers, less magic. What's up with that? 4 concepts from neuroscience, developmental neuropsychology, are important here. To refresh our memory or to update our psychological knowledge, we leave the argument for a moment to discuss these concepts. Accommodation versus assimilation, variant versus invariant or invariant analysis, top-down versus bottom-up, and synesthesia. Let's begin with the first. Accommodating means that new cognitive, affective and/or action schemes are formed in the brain in response to experiences in the world. For example, in the brain of a baby in the cradle, trails emerge on basis of the speech of, among others, parents and family. Each such trail results from structured patterns, repeats in the input, which encrypt a brain accommodation, cells that fire together, wire together. From then, similar patterns in the input can be assimilated in this scheme, making the variance in the input through assimilating it invariant. So it makes variant sound invariant by recognizing it, by assimilating it into a trail. For instance, if someone keeps saying ba 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 ba, a corresponding accommodation or scheme is created. Subsequently, in such accommodation, future ba 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 signals will be assimilated from speech. Then this signal has become invariant. Our brain is triggered, however, by variance. That is, by signals or input that can't yet be accommodated. So the brain is constantly analyzing variance into invariance and variance. So if someone says ba 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 da ba 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 da ba 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 da, then the da is again variant. There is not yet an accommodation in which it can be assimilated. This is a so-called mismatch, detected in the brain as mismatch negativity, which does not yet fit in the accommodated scheme. The ba 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 accommodation will be adjusted by forming a ba 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 da ba sub-accommodation. From then on, there is also a schedule in which this variant can be assimilated. For example, based on a lot of experience, analysis of input, in this case sounds, the brain makes a lot of variant signal invariant by creating a large number of accommodations in which it can be assimilated. In this way, thousands of accommodations are created, which are increasingly integrated hierarchically. The cognitive recognition system that thus arises can assimilate more and more input and thus experience. As people get older, less and less adaptation or accommodation of the cognitive system is required. Brain processes are then mostly driven by assimilation instead of accommodation. Assimilation is sufficient to transform any input into knowledge and adequate responses. Assimilation is driving on the brain its autopilot. So variants in the environment or input, our experiences in the world, are made invariant through accommodations, through the process of assimilation. Assimilating variants in the accommodation results in invariance and thus knowledge and a predictable response. Accommodation may cross modalities when, for instance, a form or a color is associated with a word. Also 5 senses, sight, smell, hearing, taste and touch may be crossed. When, for instance, a sound or musical structure is tightly associated with a form. We all have synesthesia. We all can be touched by music, for instance, but some people develop it to a much more substantial level than others do. For example, some people have systematically coupled color to numbers. In psychological experiments, they are able to distinguish, for instance, a few 2's in a field of 5's, or the other way around, much faster than normal subjects. They just see the deviant color. In this case, the 2's, the red 2's in the field of 5. While we, normal people, just see black 5's and 2's, which isn't as easy to distinguish. Bottom-up means growth in an incremental way, in contrast to top-down, which means creating or working from a plan or scheme. Development has both bottom-up features, trial and error, mimicking, just acting or doing something, being reactive, etc., and top-down features, goal-directedness, for instance, being prospective, conscious control. The distinction between the couples, however, bottom-up versus top-down, accommodation versus assimilations, variance versus invariance, isn't always as clear as it seems to be. Every incident, for instance, an accident, is variant from a specific point of view, but also predictable and is invariant from another perspective. For instance, in the case of an accident, shit happens. Well, so much for a short refresher course in psychology. Let's go back to our
In
argument.
the dead of night.
Every child enters the world illiterate. The onset of the acquisition of our first language begins when our brains start to construct invariants from an endless stream of variant sounds. Your brain constructs traces based on the sounds of the voice of, among others, your mother with a high pitch and your daddy with a low pitch. But while pitch is still variance, the sound also includes regularities and repeats that can be detected and thus constructed into additional invariant brain traces. Cells that fire together, wire together. That's the so-called Hebbian rule. Slowly but steadily, in a bottom-up manner, each child constructs its own native language. However, in learning a second language at a later age, for instance in high school, the circumstances are completely different. You're no longer helpless lying in your crib or box. In addition, you have built an instrument of understanding, your first language. The new language will be learned to a large extent through the first language, through some kind of top-down shortcuts. This may be disadvantageous. With newborns, their first contact with the world is on a sensory-motor basis, through tasting and touching, bringing things to the mouth. The first words accomplish and later replace the sensory-motor understandings. In this way, words stand for grasp without having to grab, a kind of abstract grasping or understanding. In this sense, first language acquisition is all about abstract understanding, grasping of things, events and situations, very much in a bottom-up manner. However, learning a second or third language is not primarily based on bottom-up properties. Top-down aspects, already present language, knowledge of the world, etc., prevent the bottom-up emergence and therefore acquisition of the new language. Moreover, in second language acquisition, there is much less synesthesia, connection between different modalities, sound and hearing, shape, sight, etc. That sort of things. Both because second language acquisition depends grossly on top-down processes and because the brain has already been divided into specialities or modularity. Knowing this, it offers opportunities for education. A good language teaching method should inhibit reasoning and all the same facilitate bottom-up aspects of the first language acquisition, laying in the arms of a teacher who really loves you, like your mother did. What does this have to do with Elvis? Often a first-generation artist, scientist or writer is particularly busy discovering new art, techniques or science in a bottom-up manner. They are inventing themselves, quite illiterate in terms of their to-be-reached achievements. The second generation is literate, using top-down shortcuts, knowing what has become successful. Often this leads to stereotype, exaggeration, but if people aim for more than imitation, if they aim for transformation, this can lead to redeveloping. Then again, this second generation becomes a new first generation, bottom up, and goes on exploration. New language variation, theory, music style may be born. Finally, virtually all major inventions are done simultaneously, in multiple places, often independently. The big name is the first one who came to the patent office, or the artist who was in the right place at the right time. Also that is true. History, both individually and collectively, emerges bottom-up. Illiteracy means that one seeks bottom-up, not yet fully injected by reason, as opposed to literacy, top-down with reason. Sometimes novelty emerges, easier from illiteracy than from literacy. In the second language we have learned to trust our reason, our literacy. We've forgotten to hear our hearts, the magic. The advantages of illiteracy have become unattainable. In any situation concerning development, it is important to make room for exploration, starting from relative illiteracy. In education, more attention should be paid to this.
You ain't one. You ain't one.
Lifelong learning. Well, I've previously argued that an advantage of literacy is that people are not bothered by what they already know. On the contrary, in an educated person, novelty acquisition is mainly achieved by organizing and regrouping already present knowledge. Unless you learn a complete new skill with a considerable amount of motor components in it, learning ability is critical depending on the quality of the developed accommodations. What's up with that? In illiteracy, new knowledge and skills are mainly acquired bottom-up, for instance by exploration, imitation, trial and error, etc. In contrast, in literacy, for example, the second language is partly learned through the top-down knowledge of the first language. With literacy, I mean that there is not yet an accommodation, knowledge structure available in which the to-be-learned content can be assimilated. As a consequence, in dealing or interacting with the to-be-mastered learning contents, new brain cells, connections or configurations of such connections are formed. This process is comparable with the origin of a river. Because the meltwater flows down from the mountaintop and eventually wears out a channel, the stronger this channel is already formed, the easier new meltwater can be absorbed or assimilated into it. In our brains, innumerable traces emerge. By assimilating activity into these brain traces, re-executing learned patterns for instance, the traces become deeper and deeper. In this way, our brain is not just a river, but a complete city that arises bit by bit. A historic city reflects the functionality of yesteryear. The floor plan, roads, squares, canals, drainage connections and sewerage. In short, the infrastructure and the houses, warehouses, shops, etc. are the result of the learning process of the city. The more infrastructure or accommodation is there, the less completely new functionalities can be added. A city built in the late Middle Ages with narrow alleys, canals and high warehouses cannot assimilate the necessary requirements of a modern megastore. Houses from the Middle Ages, for example, do not have hundreds of square meters of floors, and the gigantic lorries do not fit through the narrow alleyways. In other words, in the canal houses, the customers will have to go up and down stairs much more often, and the suppliers will have to load their cargo into smaller carts on the edge of the historic city. The city lacks accommodation capacity because there is already too much infrastructure. In fact, the city is literate, but in another time, in another different language.